Toronto from Amsterdam last night. And so bear with me, please. I'm a little bit jet lagged, and I have a head cold, or maybe just I have an experience of all flyers that I've been bombarded by such bad air for so long that I'm having trouble adjusting.
Gary, sorry. Gary, could you move a bit towards the screen for the video? Yes. You see?
No, actually, that's worse because he's covering actually to the more to the left.
Oh.
Yeah. To the right, sorry. To my left, you're right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Stage right. Stage right. I'm quite interested, though, in one of the things that Paul, just as a preface, one of the things that Paul mentioned, and that is a strange liquidity which is not wet. The bucket full of confetti, as pointed out. I'm going to give some examples of some very peculiar combinations of some of the fundamental elements in the contemporary context, in our contemporary world. And in order to explore some of the more transgressive combinatorial possibilities of a very traditional set of elements that date to, obviously, pre-Socratic thought. And I'll remind you of these basic elements in pre-Socratic thought, although obviously some of you will need no reminder. Especially Ron, of course, needs no reminder of these things. The ancient metaphysical diagram of the four basic unchanging roots or elements, earth, air, fire, and water, is the starting point for my investigation. Closely associated with the poems and fragments of Empedocles, as well as the explications, or perhaps we could say standardization, presented by Aristotle, in combining multiple traditions of the one, unitary metaphysics, this metaphysics of the many also posed a series of puzzles about how a quartet that was supposedly equal in influence and originality, yet different, singular, and combinatory, could account for change, that is, could account for becoming, without themselves changing. Indeed, it's not simply that we have a pluralization of unitary metaphysics up to this point, but then we have this idea that these are somehow basic elements that are not themselves affected by the change that they affect. And in fact, it's not clear that there are even four, or only four. A unifying love, a principle of love, and a dissolving strife may in fact be the fifth and sixth elements, or at least principles or forces that impinge upon the basic roots from the outside, and these may in fact be more active than the passive quartet themselves, hence introducing a kind of heterogeneity into the composition of the elements, or at least a hierarchy that may or may not be significant. And these are all debatable points. Each of the root principles that are impinged upon then, we can imagine, despite the fact that they each have divine persona, need to be moved in some fashion because they do not move themselves. These puzzles, these are philosophical puzzles of the tradition. They will not interest me so much in this paper because my goal is to look at this diagram in a more contemporary light. I do not mean by this to mount a general purpose symbology of the seasons or of the qualities or even of the transformations implied by the basic elements in the manner, say, of Michael Pollan, who in his most recent book on cooking points out that the four fundamental elements are fermentation, aeration, barbecuing, and boiling, as it were, which correspond more or less to these fundamental elements and the qualities. Now, what I want you to gather from these first two images is that all of the action in the ancient world, as it were, was around the edge. That crossing this way was not, of course it did occur, and you have, the underworld is generated in fact by this kind of crossing, but the combinatorial possibilities of the schema occur only on the outside and in terms of adjacencies and neighboring combinations. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to move forward to a place where we can see some strange combinations at work. And I'm going to give you a few examples. However, before I get to those examples, I want to tell you what I have in mind about the basic organizational diagram. And by a diagram, I do not mean a static representational device. Rather, a diagram is a dynamic and productive device that leads thought to new places. In fact, it may even assist in the construction of new realities, or at least the discovery of a world that is just taking shape or has yet to come. The diagram's creativity is, however, filtered by constraints. It is not completely a matter of free association. The diagram works, it is productive, it forces things together, but not without some lines to guide its unfurling. The diagram in question does not distribute the same godly quartet of elements. The matters with which a diagram concerns itself are less fixed, less distinctly formed, that is, less substance-like, and it maintains independence from its contents. Of course, it has little need for transcendent reference. The diagram, in addition, does not project the idea that the elements are natural. They may, in fact, be artificial, or a mixture of both natural and artificial in some indeterminate schema. So we have a violation of nature-culture distinction. The diagram, in the sense in which I want to think it, pilots a forward-looking trajectory in the form of an experiment with what I'm calling the new fundamental elements of our time, of a contested planet, as it were. The diagram is productive of thought, and it runs ahead of explanations of it. So attending to the diagram's protensions, as opposed to its retentions, its protensions, what it throws forward as it jumps ahead of its shadow in front of itself, shows us that the emphasis on the elements as substances gives way to fragments and forces in degrees and a redistribution of the nature-culture distinction and a violation of the rules governing the combinatorial possibilities of the ancient schema. The approach I am outlining then requires me to forego as much as possible the standardized elements, and instead of settling into their established territories and thinking from them, rather to think not of positioning or in a position, but in the passageways between them. However, this is neither a recipe for inversion, simple inversion, nor for additions to the quadrangle. Indeed, I want to think of the elements as a field of charged particles that create the conditions for an event, and not as defining relations prior to this occurrence. So something has to leap out from the elements that is not given in advance. That's the movement that I'm trying to make. To grasp the dynamism of a diagram is to think of the elements not prior to the event, but as contributing to it, not so much causing it. The elements are not in a set relationship to one another until they assist in setting off an event that resolves their tensions. The event which takes off from them, takes off from the elements, may be maybe very fast, like a flash of lightning, or very slow, like the disintegration of an iceberg. Such events are individual and maintain an autonomous existence from the elements themselves. They contrast with the field from which they emerged, in other words. So this is one way of thinking about, a little bit differently, about these elements, and I'll give you an example. In It's both metaphysical and empirical at the same time. So this section is titled Dust. The example I want to talk about is dust. This is a diagram that shows, first of all, what you have the typical transformations around the quartet of elements. And we're going to move very rapidly out of these ancient desires for the dry to become wet and the warm to become cooler and the cooler to become warmer in a moment. And we should just remind ourselves where we began. So the Persian philosopher Reza Nagaristani offers an analysis of geomythical or elusive, as he puts it, foundation of the Middle East as a dust plateau in the form of dust particles and fluxes and how they mix according to a revised version of the diagram that we've been discussing. Nagaristani's original redrawing of the diagram, and I'll show you that now, expresses a trajectory that is influenced by the combination of three elements with various kinds of wetness. However, X element, where water would be, is the transformation point or the strange liquidity, like the bucket full of confetti that transforms into new trajectories, like the diagram protending forward. So you have combinations that are very interesting in this respect. Water, or a strange water-like liquidity that modifies fire, producing a new line. I'll give you an example of that shortly. You can think for a moment on what kind of combinations of water and fire in contemporary life are significant, or at least disturbingly significant, I should say, because all of these examples that I'm going to give are in some ways ecological disaster scenarios. So this is Nagaristani's version of the diagram that changes the trajectory upon intersecting with an alternative to water. And you can redraw this in a number of ways. I haven't done this myself, but you can take, for instance, water as the liquidity that he finds peculiar to the Middle East, as his example, and move water back in here and put fire and use the different kind of geographical, geomythical location. His example, though, is dust. Let's talk about dust. He begins by pointing out that the dust particles carry materials from many different territories and places, and together creatively compose some rather odd collective assemblages. Sometimes we call these clouds, as in dust clouds. Sometimes we call them dust devils. Other times we simply note the mineral and metal traces in clouds. This has become an important part of a particulate analysis, for instance. It gathers matters, both natural and unnatural, from afar and brings them together. Although they are in themselves nomadic, they don't cease moving when they arrive at a place. Although dust is in this sense creative, it is also rapidly dissipated. So self-creation is linked to self-degeneration. Flux and reflux, that is the norm. Dust returns to its nomadic existence. It reseeds itself from which it emerged. This is a kind of creative nihilism that we find in Nagaristani's thought, which challenges vitalism. It's a sort of anti-vitalism, or it is the vitalism of nihilism. Dust transcends itself back into the immanence out of which it came, in short. The ancient desire of the dry for the wet, for the dry to be rehydrated and settled, is to render dusty air, earth, and fire, but to connect these with alternatives. First of all, alternatives to water. The first and most obvious moisturizer, Nagaristani points out, is oil. This has had many messy results, we know, in the desert wars of our times, not only in the Middle East, but elsewhere in Africa. But we also have our own version of this strange liquidity in the northern Alberta tar sands, which is a paradoxical kind of oil because it has to be separated from sand. It's precisely this process that has made it subject to some fairly wild conjectures over the last 50 years or so, when the prospect of getting this oil out of the ground generated all kinds of strange imaginings, like using nuclear energy to somehow melt it, to today's sort of washing methods, which produces all kinds of unusable and unrecyclable forms of liquids. There are other obscure wetnesses that are involved, and when these abominable particles settle in the earth, they contaminate it until they dry out or are drawn out. As Negarestani says, the carnal diagrams of flesh are imbued with dust soup, like adulterated sausages filled with sawdust, or fraudulently doctored automobile transmissions filled with sawdust, both augmented in unproductive ways. Pairing with what are called questionable liquidities revolutionizes particles. It gives to them unusual propensities in the form of dry hails, he points out, consisting of crystals carrying sand, or rains consisting of pebbles, sometimes what are called blood-red Saharan rains, torrents of monsters, rains of toads and fish. More practically, we can apply the principles of the event discussed above to dust. Dust can explode under many industrial conditions, especially in confined places with atmospheric oxygen sources like silos, mills, and mines. In high concentrations, dust, once it reaches a minimal ignition temperature, may ignite when in contact with accidentally heated surfaces, especially metals, producing sparks, generating friction heat, or releasing electromagnetic discharges by the fluxes of the particles themselves. A dust explosion resolves the cloud of particles under tension, and only water or fire retardant foam will settle it. When I was living for a number of years in Thunder Bay, we had a whole series of mills on the lake, and the most extraordinary thing was to see part of a mill, part of the wall blown out of the mill when there was an explosion, a dust-generated explosion. Extremely violent act, very extremely volatile situation. And this is the same situation that's arising now in burning peat pellets, waste wood pellets. Blew the hole out of the side of the power generating station in the city as well when I was there. So dust can be quite volatile. Now the point Negarestani is getting at is that the root elements lose their integrity and arrangement of their neighboring and opposite elements when modified by alien liquidities beyond the wet and the cold. So the fourth element precipitating an alien cosmogenesis in combination with the fluids, so to speak, derived from, as he puts it, the Dead Seas and the dust storms, the various haboobs, as they're called, that blow through the region that he's talking about. The seeding of otherworldly building processes not only tangles the roots, but intervenes in an established pattern by means of outsider impositions. Now I want to take some direction from Negarestani and look at proliferating bonds across and beyond the root elements as new materials are introduced into elemental territories and mix uneasily with them, creating new cosmic dynamics. Some of you may be familiar with this image. Do not drink this water. Oops, that side. So the next section is flammable water. So I'm transgressing here the distinction between water and fire. Before Lake Erie became a toxic soup of algae blooms and frightening invader species, a tributary of this lake, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, was famous for catching on fire a number of times over a 100-year period, culminating in the oil sludge and garbage blaze in the summer of 1969. Some claim this gave birth to the modern environmental movement in North America. More recently, this perverse wetness that either proves or disproves the hydrophobia of oil, I'm not sure which, has been displaced by a bizarre cocktail of leaked methane and well water. As the infamous scene from Josh Fox's documentary Gasland demonstrates, methane makes tap water supply flammable as a likely result of leaks or gas migration from hydraulic fracturing or natural gas fracking operations that are being undertaken nearby. And here you have someone who's turned on the tap and has taken their portable Bic lighter and lit the water on fire. It's a very interesting scene when they're trying to make the case for the spoilage of their well water by fracking operations. Such threats to groundwater, the integrity of groundwater, exacerbated not only by the methane but by fracking fluids themselves, a rather potent cocktail of toxins, forge a burnable explosive wetness that bubbles in the water and flows around it as well. So the water begins to behave like a bottle of Perrier in a sense, with also methane wrapping itself around it. Now, according to the rules of direct transformation discovered by Aristotle, water cannot be directly transformed into fire. The rule governing direct transformation requires adjacency around the triangle. However, there are going to be some deviations and some aberrations that I'm going to describe. As fire and water are not adjacent, but opposed, they lack a so-called common quality. Hence, an indirect transformation may take place by means of the introduction of a linking element, namely air, or a type of air, which in this case is methane, an odorless and colorless gas, which is also combustible and commonly used as a fuel. However, the intermediate state that forms is in virtue of troubling leakages from the earth. Deep or near the surface, it can be either, and is also complicated by the fact that the air in question is not breathable. That is, methane is an asphyxiate gas. What is even more significant is that the use of an intermediate air-like element may also display water-like characteristics when methane pools in dense layers in a non-absorbent confined space. And apparently, it can even support objects if it's thick enough. It can even float a paper boat in the methane pool. Now these are abnormalities, and I'm just describing. Here's a typical transformation between water and earth in which mud is created. And the adjacency is straightforward, and mud, of course, can be a very productive substance, can be used to create all kinds of objects, can be used to create sculptures and art, can be used to beautify bodies by being laid onto the skin and so forth. It has many quite positive properties. When we look at fracking fluid and flammable methane leaks combining across this breach, we need a transformational dimension here that's introduced. So we have this asphyxiating air that is unbreathable. However, it cools and becomes more water-like and shifts downward and enters back into the water dimension here. So these are toxins, these are flammables, these are unbreathable airs, and strangely behaving water-like airs. So this is how I'm starting to redraw the relations of the fundamental elements using some of these examples. Chemical marriages of fire and water, certainly worthy of Hades and Persephone, but with a contemporary geography of the underworld defined by big energy corporations and environmentalists, accidental environmentalists or otherwise. Today, lovely Harmonia, the daughter of love and strife, has a more engaged political and policy role to play in the redrawing of this diagram. Now the next example I want to look at is blood. Blood on the Earth's rich flows. Nagarstani looks at oil as a lubricant that moves the Earth towards its Tellurian omega point of degradation and destruction in his own mytho-metaphysics. He talks about the militantly horizontal desert, the desertification of the Earth. Indeed, the myth of oil as an exhaustible resource brings the world a little closer to the kingdom of God and a new power. Yet in this use of a dying resource towards death, there is a strange unity at work, evident in the pacifist slogan, "No blood for oil." In other words, the real price of oil is the blood of our war dead. The gory coagulant and the Tellurian lube share a common lineage, Nagarstani is arguing, porphyrin, the pigment purple in red blood cells, and petroporphyrin, a geological substance. By accepting this common lineage, Nagarstani claims that pacifists support the poverty of finite oil despite the partial renewability of both blood and oil. This does not mean that oil is any less bound to death, and this is especially true of blood. This is a complicated diagram because we've lost water that has been taken over by this other substance, which is both metaphorical and metaphysical at the same time. Because you'll see as we develop this critique that sometimes we're dealing with the actual blood of the dead, but also the blood of a stigmatization of a natural substance or a quasi-natural substance. A number of non-governmental organizations have disseminated the phrase blood diamonds within a growing complex of contested minerals. Profits from diamond mining in Africa, especially in the Angola, Congo, and Sierra Leone, have funded weapons, armies, and civil wars. International certification regimes have been created to prevent blood diamonds from entering the global diamond market. And every legitimate diamond is said to be traceable to its place of origin under these accreditation programs. But this was precisely the problem that the blood supply faced in the 1980s and the early 1990s, before the expansion of screening programs in the light of the devastating impact of HIV/AIDS on the hemophiliac community. Recently, new technologies for screening have been introduced with greater hemovigilance and a move to targeting donors who are low risk, voluntary, and unpaid. So this good blood can be tracked from donor to patient, just like the movement of ethical diamonds through the supply chain. So you have essentially two different versions of the blood referent. Not all such flows, either blood or complex minerals, enjoy this level of surveillance. Control over mines in some countries remains highly fluid. Such shifting politics, in which states confront an outside, in which very different peoples confront one another, aptly characterizes the situation with coltan quarrying on the Congo-Rwanda border. Coltan, if you've not heard of it, has anyone heard of coltan? Stuff that is in your cell phone, in your Game Boy. in most every computer. Coltan is the short form for a mineral columbite tantalite, which contains niobium and tantalum, used in capacitors for high-tech devices like cell phones and electronic circuitry in general. The struggle for control of the mine on the Congo-Rwandan border between the Congolese army and a rebel militia of displaced Rwandan militiamen, as well as the interception of raw materials in nearby rebel-controlled villages, illustrates the shifting ground within and beyond borders. So we have these holes in the earth, these legal and illegal mines, through which and around which the blood flows. Blood coltan, as it's called, is a documentary by Patrick Forestier from 2007 in which Congolese miners complain about foreigners profiting from Congolese resources, by which they mean Rwandans occupying Congolese territory, as well as the corporate buyers like the European, the Belgian, the German, the Swiss, and the Dutch businesses implicated in the continuation of the conflict in the country and between the countries. Additionally, as Michael Nest explains in his study Coltan, origins of this blood trail are hard to determine when dealing with stubbornly generic primary commodities like coltan. Coltan is different than both diamonds and human blood in the sense that it is a primary commodity that it's not subject to surveillance. It's quite different. It flows more freely and is not traceable. So it has a different characteristic than the other kinds of blood we're talking about. The shifting politics of its production is further complexified by illegal mining operations in the national parks, like the Congo's Kahuza-Biega, which has put the mountain gorillas that make their home there under threat. Indeed, the exploitation of child labor, illegal mining, the imposition of taxes by armed groups on mines and miners, which funds weapons, as well as the use of national military networks for the illegal export of the unprocessed mineral, which ensures international inaction, as such armies may not be categorized as armed groups and thus not subject to sanctions at all, makes the blood coltan, or even agitations for guerrilla-safe cell phones, ligatures that are really hard to stick. It's much easier to make the blood line, the line of blood, and the line of diamonds stick. Coltan has not arrived there yet, so it's only emerging now. Every mine is a kind of line of flight that is in communication with all kinds of smooth spaces, as Deleuze and Guattari say. The problem with this definition of closeness, of shifting orientations, of relativizing classical paths and stable distinctions, is that it perfectly describes the tensions of blood mineral production and trade, illegal mining, and continuation of war by extortion and violence racked by various smoothnesses. The Earth's mineral fluxes are ungrounded in complexes of holes and surface pits whose lines of flight are given favorable passages through preferential channels paid for in blood by military capitalism and capitalist militarism. But more importantly, coltan's use in telecommunications helps us grasp the recreation of the Earth into a machinic phylum, a continuous plane for smooth communication across networks, and the strangely evolving entanglements of human and technical components. But under these conditions, where there is no capacity to standardize, to survey, to striate, to control and inspect, free action tends towards a lubricious dryness and traffic slicked with blood, another kind of X-wetness. Blood as the untraceable X-wetness that modifies all the elements it comes into contact. So let's see if we can get to one more example. Atmo-terror. The unnatural desertification that brings about the Tellurian omega in Nagarastani's thought is was contributed to by such diverse acts as the Taliban destruction of the statues of Buddha in the Bamiyan Valley, plasticization of multiple environments, Pacific and Atlantic Ocean garbage patches. Those are very interesting phenomena. The plastic islands that have been discovered in the oceans. Oil spills, mining accidents, industrial disasters, melting alpine glaciers, and military violence around primary resources extraction around the world. The question that Peter Sloterdijk poses is whether and under which conditions a basic element like air can itself become a war theater, a weapon and a battlefield in its own right. Terrorism, as Sloterdijk defines it, is the maximal explication of the other from the point of view of his exterminability, end quote. So atmo-terror, in the form of a dark meteorology, consists of lethal clouds and deadly precipitations developed originally on the gas fronts of World War I and necessitated a combination of environmental and design consciousnesses. To make the open air lethal, I'm not talking about enclosed spaces, I'm talking about open battlefields. So to make the open air lethal is to make it unbreathable within a quasi-contained theater, according to the balance between factors affecting the air pressure, humidity, diffusion, wind prediction, all of those factors. Because of course if you release a mustard gas and the wind blows it back onto you, it's not obviously it's not the goal in operation. The ground campaign chemical attack gives way post-World War II to the aerochemical war in Morocco during the mid-20s, for instance, culminating with the atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that created radioactive deserts as part of this desertification. As a condition of existence, the atmosphere supporting collective life worlds is erased through poisoning. Now, we have Nagarstani reminds us that air, so the ancient meaning of air was not a transparent, breathable, but a foggy element. It's doubly clouded, we could say. Before Anaximenes, air was murky, foggy and dark. Garstani relates it to the fog of war, until it was distilled and clarified in a cosmogenic distillation unification process. Unable to dissipate the long-standing mist of war that lingers in it, air is again darkened by atmo-terror, by air war, by gas attack, chlorine, phosgene, mustard, and the long-term lethality of radioactive particles emitted by nuclear weapons. The darker the skies, the more intense the conflict. Even pollution, like the heavy smog that engulfs Beijing on many days, or the threat of airborne viruses like SARS, can bring out the HEPA-filtered breathing masks, a reminder of the gas masks of World War I. See if I can take this a little bit further and bring this to a conclusion. So, instead of a quartet of elements that are combined according to the ancient rubrics of the adjacency, but which can be transgressed with some of the contemporary examples I gave, crossing in an X. This one signifies center pinwheel signifying multiple crossing points, but also circular and interfering channels in which plasticized waters, which is the environment perfused with plastics, both the earth and the water. And oil as a kind of tellurian lubricant, pushing politics in a circle, but also including some other elements that I've not fleshed out completely in this short presentation, greenhouse gases and hot and lasers and plasmas and so forth, which I would include closer to the fire corner. The significance of minerals for the electronics industries, for the automobile industries, as well as blood. You will see that based upon the analyses presented, it is possible to repopulate the diagram with new fundamental elements. Earth, an earth of dust, water of blood, air of lethal fogs, fire of flammables, as in the methane example. Wrapped around these elements is a planetary phylum, a great Tellurian cable bunch, as it were, with its own products. The Earth with its electronics, water with liquidities like bottled water, which I'll even get to, which throws forward diagrammatic intensities in the explosion of plastic debris. Air with its gases, its greenhouse gases in particular, and fire with its artificial plasmas and lasers. However, as we have seen, the new elements combine both in existing direct, that is, blood mixed with dust, and the extraction of conflict minerals and oil fields, or methane, a flammable unnaturally mingled with the water supply, and which contributes to the greenhouse gas effect, and extra-rotational combinations by means of especially communicative matters like microscopic fragments of plastics that perfuse the oceans and get into the food chain, and in and of themselves constitute fine dusts that affect respiration, settling among the fogs, the gases, and the lethal clouds that we encounter in our daily lives, in our carpeted offices. The example of blood as a general liquid of exchange extends beyond the human to the mountain gorillas butchered for bushmeat to feed the armies and laborers engaged in illegal mining operations. So this is neither an environmental nor an aesthetics of the elements, but an unruly diagram of abominable combinations and post-natural forces and substances. Thank you. Sort of a horror story.
Yeah, could I go back to your sort of introductory remarks? You mentioned Anaximenes, and it seems to me one of the fascinating things about Anaximenes that makes him, to me, sound so incredibly modern in a way,
Yes.
is that he has just one element and one dimension, one fundamental dimension in which that element changes, which is its degree of concentration, or what's the opposite of concentration? Dilution.
Diffusion. Diffusion.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
But essentially, so in its maximally diffused way, it's fire.
Yes.
Then it's air. Then it's water. Then it's this one. Now that goes with other properties like hot and cold, and indeed it presumably generates all the phenomenal qualities by means of a single transformation. Right? Remember, he even has an experiment to prove that air, when it's warm, is dilated. Dilation is the
dilation.
the
Okay.
air is, when dilated, air is warm, but when it's concentrated, it's cold, and you can prove it by holding out your finger, and if you go like this, you're dilating the air, and you'll see that it's warm. But if you go like this, you're concentrating the air, and then you'll feel that it's cold. So what interests me about this in relation to your revision of diagrams is that you've been, in a way, magnificently indifferent to the actual chemistry involved, and in doing so, you haven't given us any notion of whether there are still some fundamental dimensions in which transformations are more causally fundamental, as opposed to, as it were, mythically fundamental than others.
I'm trying to move outside of a causal explanation model into a combinatory model that becomes more semiotical as it moves forward, but retaining, I think I've retained some of the metaphysical assumptions.
Well, that's what it seemed to me. That's why I was interested in your comment.
Yeah, that this is for me the key to understanding where the diagram points forward is in these aberrant and abominable combinations. Even though I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but when I say that, when I'm saying that methane behaves in a certain way, I'm basing it upon pretty straightforward scientific reports on methane's behavior from nature and so forth. But
the concept of an abominable combination is not exactly one that we recognize in chemistry.
No, of course not. But of course the behavior of the elements in combination is only descriptively suggestive of those combinations. But I want to retain that descriptive dimension that I get from the Garstani and Sloterdijk and others, which I think quite enlivens the basic discussion of how opposites combine and what transformations exist in a contested world. And that's my reasoning. Yes.
Thank you. I found myself as a reformed combustion engineer. I started off in the natural gas industry actually a long time ago, and I grew up across the lake from Cleveland. So a lot of everything I was anticipating all along the way, you hit everything I was anticipating, up to radiation and stuff like that. So my question goes sort of, maybe this goes too far afield, so stop me. I was also thinking of Sir Richard Burton, the explorer, and this is one of my own sort of long-term side deals. And his, specifically when he was in Somalia, and he was writing about how the silly natives thought that mosquitoes would give malaria, but he knew better. It was the smell of the water. And so he set himself up far away so that he would not be near the smell. He would avoid the smell of the water, but those silly natives thought it was the mosquitoes that were bringing malaria. And so it reminds me of that. And so smell is one of those things that's not easily categorized, and it's a psychological phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon, a physiological phenomenon. There is a chemistry to it, and it sort of goes. It's the one thing I'm wondering about, because it goes with all of this, and it can be that you can be habituated to a smell as well, so that you don't notice it after a while. So I was wondering about that.
This is interesting. I was thinking in terms of the odorlessness of so many gases, and the fact that smells are now imported into them for safety purposes, which gives them a kind of olfactory signature they would otherwise not have, at least for humans. The human sensorium is incapable mostly of smelling those kinds of things. But this is it could, in addition to what Ron said about the issue of concentration and dilation, that could be a scale that's introduced into this analysis. I simply went for the fragment. I simply went for particleization, fragmentation of block elements. We could introduce another scale, which is a sensory scale, which is a perceptual scale in which smell and visual appearance and so forth are also included in the analysis, in order to bring out some of the other qualitative features of some of the more aberrant combinations of particles. And I think that would be a very rich development to take this a little bit further than what I've outlined today. But your example is also interesting because the error that's introduced, and it's that element of error and mistakenness that I think is extremely important. It's like the example that Paul gave of the confetti in the bucket. It's the strange liquidity that's mistaken, and that's what the force of the joke is derived surely from the fact that it's mistaken as a wetness. Just as in your example, the force of the story is derived precisely from the fact that the smell of the water has nothing to do with the transmission of the illness. In both cases, it's that surprising element that alerts us to something, puts us off balance, shakes us up a little bit, so that we're more vigilant in recognizing some of the implications. And so I think that's an important point. If I could, I'm trying to think off cuff of a good example. I think go ahead. I mean, methane is an obvious one. But
methane is an obvious one because it's and this one I can speak to is I can't actually smell methyl mercaptan, which is what we use in Canada.
Yeah.
And that's introduced at 14 parts per million.
Yeah.
And so we smell that, and that's like a very, very trace amount.
Yeah.
And we used to measure it when I worked, it's not far from here at CGA Labs, and they measure the flow through the Trans-Canada pipeline every day to make sure, and then they add it and they measure to make sure the pressure and temperature correction and the whole deal. And it's very, very tiny, and it's enough to make people run to the telephone.
Yes.
To pull the alarm. But the other example I was thinking of was the example of London and the development of their sewage system. And again, the idea of smell transmitting the diseases.
Yes.
But it was actually the water that was contaminated with illness, right?
But this is interesting with methane. The example in the still from the film that I gave is the butane and the methane with the flint create the explosion. I mean, you do need, in that example, even though it is flammable under certain conditions, it will self-combust, but under the conditions in which it's flowing through the tap, unless there's a heat source somewhere, in the flow inside or outside the house, it won't self-combust unless it's actually lit. So that's another example of it. You can smell when you smell the flint, there's danger. If you realize there's a flammable gas that's loose in the room. It's an interesting observation, though, of cross applying an explanation to another sensory modality, but based upon a whole different regime of understanding of contagion as well. What got me really started on this topic was thinking about bottled water and the way in which so many plastic containers produce various kinds of pollutants and dangers. And we always used to have these examples of empty bottles of water floating in the lake and floating in all various other kinds of bodies of water, but being crushed for recycling, but generating this incredible dust that just gets into everything, so that the entire food chain becomes kind of plasticized in a way. We say with our clothing, the plastic clothing, that when it breaks down and shreds, it goes into the earth, it goes into the ground, it goes into the groundwater, and it's consumed by various creatures and so on and so forth. So that's the origin of my thinking on a simple everyday product, a simple everyday act of opening a bottle of water. Some places, of course, it's absolutely necessary to do that because the water is so unstable and undrinkable. There's nothing but bottled water. In the far north, close to where I spent quite a bit of time, this is a very common place. The water itself was not usable. The poorly modernized systems that were put into place 50 years ago are no longer functioning, and everyone had bottled water, but nowhere to put the bottle. Okay, do.